So, now, one of the most famous scenes, of course, and this is something, of course, we only have to visualize because of written records, is when Richmond falls to the Union Army. Abraham Lincoln rides down to Richmond, and he'll walk into Jefferson Davis's White House. And according to the story, Lincoln sat behind the man's desk and put his feet up on the chair and had a swig of his whiskey that he was drinking. And you could just imagine the grin on, Honest Abe's face. But whatever happened to the Confederate treasury?
Well, that's an interesting question. On April the 2nd, Jefferson Davis was in church, and he got a message given to him by one of his aides that said, General Lee has said he can no longer hold the city, he's evacuating. Jefferson Davis left the church and began the preparation for the government's evacuation of Richmond. Well, you would have thought that after months of siege, they might have made some plans, but not so much. Man Quarles, a clerk in the Confederate Treasury, talks about how on the night before the final departure from Richmond, they were piling gold, silver, paper money into boxes and barrels. Nobody was keeping an account of it. He whipped out some brown paper and started writing down the amounts in each of the barrels and boxes. But it was a pretty loose affair. There were runs on the banks. The people, were trying to get their own money out of the Richmond banks. The whiskey stocks were thrown open, and there were all kinds of mobs in the streets. The Confederate Army set fire to the arsenals and to the public stores so they wouldn't fall into the hands of the Yankees. Well, pretty soon the fire spread and things were blowing up all over Richmond, and there was just massive chaos. A captain of the Confederate Navy, William Parker, the next day with an armed escort took 8 wagon loads of treasure to the last train leaving Richmond, and it was going to Danville. And with this armed guard, they loaded up the Confederate treasury and headed south, followed closely by Jefferson Davis and the fleeing Confederate government.
And where did the treasury, and I assume it reached Danville?
It did reach Danville, and some informal requisitions started to be made at Danville. And when I say informal, I mean informal, because they don't know who got how much. So as you can see, the thing was beginning, to really come apart at the seams. The Confederate treasury was then loaded into wagons and headed out towards North Carolina. Jefferson Davis was trying to get south and then ultimately to cross the Mississippi and into Texas to carry on the war from, the Trans-Mississippi. Jefferson Davis really didn't believe, even now, that the Confederacy was beaten. In his mind, the Patriots of 1776 had beaten the British, by just hanging on and wearing down their will to win. And he saw no reason why the South couldn't do the same thing. He couldn't believe that this nation of 5 million people could be militarily subdued. So he had not given up the fight. The Confederate treasure train went to North Carolina, where it was met by the troops of General Johnston, who wanted their back pay. So all of a sudden they're paying out the back pay to General Johnston's men. So the treasury continues to dwindle. Next, they make it into northern Georgia. More and more disgruntled troops are showing up, armed and wanting their pay. Well, they didn't have much choice, because if they hadn't given it, they would have taken it. Mm-hmm. And so by May, the official Confederate treasury had more or less vanished. But along with the official Confederate treasury, you had the bank treasures of the Richmond banks, mm-hmm. Which was private property and had not been touched by the soldiers. Mm.
Now, I see you have a couple of books here. Could you please explain the books?
Well, I talk a lot about the last days of the Confederacy and the Confederate treasury in these books. The Echoes of the Civil War is not a narrative or an overlay with a lot of analysis. It's the actual words of the people from newspapers, letters, and so on. The people of the time speak by themselves, for themselves. Mm-hmm. And its companion volume, Treasure Legends of the Civil War, we look specifically at some of the things we've been talking here today, you know, about how plantations were repositories for the family silver and other treasures in the wells, and how people are still digging these things up, about how the Confederate tried to balance the economic woes by attacking Vermont from Canada. There was what we would call today a terrorist incursion from Canada. The idea was to rob these banks and get this money to the Confederacy. And then, of course, we talk about blockade runners, we talk about the Confederate treasury, and of course, you know, the great Confederate raiders like John Singleton Mosby and Quantrell in the West. So that is what we cover in the second.
Well, certainly there are a number of famous stories. In fact, probably one of the most interesting aspects is that even today, as you know, we have this currency here from the Confederacy, but in South Carolina, in their Treasury building today, there's apparently millions of dollars of Confederate paper money that's uncut. Some of the, you know, whatever they could roll out of this paper money that they had spent so much time doing. And this is uncut, it's sealed in their vaults, and they're not going to cut any of those bills whatsoever, because if it got flushed out into the market again for collectors to buy, the same thing would happen except in the collector's market. You'd have inflation going on there. And so this is virtually a second version of a lost Confederate treasure. And certainly when it comes to the Confederacy and its own economy, there's quite a bit to it, and there's many things that are available. And so as we learn more and more about what happens, always in the back of our minds we wonder, what kind of treasure can we find in our backyards or in a wood somewhere? Thank you for stopping by with Virginia Time Travel. We hope you'll tune in so we can all go back in time once again.